Okay. The ding gives it away. You're good unless my wife needs something. Uh, okay. So Monday. My guess, I would be. Would you be surprised if we were here on Monday? Probably, if the snow's not supposed to stop till then. I mean, how, you're in the afternoon. I mean, I'd be shocked if there were any morning classes. Absolutely shocked. So I don't know what's going to happen. We'll play it by ear. I mean, they may very well just cancel school for the day. Unfortunately, we don't have the. We've got too much to cover, and then I'm going to miss a lecture and a lab day. So, I mean, I'll probably arrange a time to log on because we go 2 o'clock and just keep going and just try to get as much lecture material and deal with the lab material because the lab was more introductory and showing how the technology is. And I can save that for a subsequent week because the lab will probably start with whatever the date is a week from Monday. Top of my head. Is that Groundhog's Day? I think it is February 2nd. We can just keep doing it over and over again, like the Bill Murray movie. Good movie. We went there. Gobbler's Knob. Nothing. Why is that special? I'm sorry, you probably went there.
I've been there.
Yeah,
Not on
oh, yeah.
Groundhog's Day, but I've been there.
And I went, and we were directed there by one of the inner circle, the great wind maker. Big now. So, long story short, we will that day, and I'll wait for instructions. I'll have them next week. We may do a wet lab. If we do a wet lab, because we may be dissecting some muscle tissue, and we would do that in the zoo lab, most likely. It's easier in the zoo lab to do that. It's convenient to the micro lab. I mean, it's just I've for as long as I've been teaching this, we've been doing that extra. We do a couple of the wet labs in the zoo lab because I don't think Dr. Hannah has anything going on with her zoo unless maybe she has open labs sometimes for that kind of stuff. For prepping for like practicals. Okay, so that's the drill. I'll email you depending on what it is. If you don't want to log, I mean, you're no force. And the same thing with being here. If you're not comfortable, whether you're on campus or not, I mean, when it comes to weather, the number one, be safe. So I mean, if you commute here, certainly take that into account. I mean, if the campus is tough to get around and it's ridiculously freezing, I'll understand. I don't have the luxury of canceling the class, but I mean, if I live in Cranberry Township, I live 25 minutes away, and so if I can't get here, I can't get here. But I'll make sure I let you know. So they give me a pass because I'm older. I don't think I've reached the heights. I don't think I'm the oldest person teaching, but I'm trying. We'll get there. Stop smiling. Well, none of you are much fun at all. All right, let's get on with it. All right, we're going to pick up where we left off. I'm going to try to buzz through, which means rapidly, this introductory material. And we left it here with good old osmosis. Okay, from a test-taking perspective, I use the term solute and solvent. Solute, stuff dissolved in the water. Universal solvent for living systems, which is all we're studying, water. What's the difference between a solution and a tincture? Excellent. Did you hear that? Those of you who are not listening, tinctures are more than half alcohol. Solutions are more than half water. In the old days, we did a lot of things with tinctures. In the old days, we had like tincture of merthiolate and tincture of iodine. And I mean, and tinctures, they go back to the days of pharmacy with apothecary measures, drams and minims. Okay. Well, you're not excited about that stuff. For those of you who are endeavoring to go into medical fields, you have to learn how to write prescriptions. It's based on, and they will still fill prescriptions with apothecary measures. Like, I mean, you'll tell them in amount, and then you'll say QS in petrolatum, which means quantum sufficient, and amount sufficient. Petrolatum is Vaseline. You put it in that. Okay? It's like tabs 2 TID 3 times a day. PO, or PO, PRN Q46H. As needed, PRN means take as needed, which is not really a good way to order medicine, but a lot of people do. So I understand. And we do just more of just a little hint on prescriptions. Anything can be, this can be a prescription. All you got to put on it is RX, which means recipe. Okay, and then your name, your whatever identifying numbers, typically license number, DEA number, If you're doing it on someone else's license, that'd be a different protocol, but similar. And you write the name of the medication, and then you have DISP, which means to dispense. It's actually from the Latin dispensare. Dispensare usually use a Roman numeral because it's safeguarded. Somebody writing for 20 Percocet, and all of a sudden they put 120. Got it? So I use the Roman numerals. And then what they call the SIG means signatore. That's the directions. 1, 2, 4, 6 HPR in pain. Got it? I did used to do this. Okay, so osmosis is the movement of solvent. It's simple diffusion of solvent, water. That's all it is. And it does, and it's, you know this already. But why it's so darn important is the osmolarity. Our bodies, we work around roughly, and I don't know the conversion. What it is, I'm not trying to teach chemistry, but about 300 milliosmoles. And all our solutions are around that. They just vary, whether it's your spinal fluid, whether it's joint fluid, whether it's plasma, whether it's interstitial fluid. It depends on where, or intracellular fluid. They all have different amounts of solutes, particularly most of the electrolytes. Sometimes. So the 300 milliosmoles, it's just it's nothing more than a ratio that's consistent, more or less, solute to solvent. And so it doesn't matter. We basically compare them. So I mean, if you have 9 particles in whatever the unit is, a gallon, a quart, a milliliter, versus 16 particles in that 1 milliliter, assuming that the water can move, effectively, you have 16 to 1. Proportionately, I mean, really what you want to do is flip the fraction. So 1/16 to 1/9, which is bigger. And clearly, 1/9 means that there's greater amount of water. It's going to move in that direction. And where are so it's going to balance it out. That's all it means. So it's going to go, and this is so terribly important. That number, and it doesn't matter, so we have different ways to achieve that. What makes normal saline normal, we call it one, technically it's one normal saline. Saline is just salt. Is that the one normal means it's approximately 300 milliosmoles. And the way they put that together is it's roughly 0.09 grams per 100 milliliters of water. That's called grams percent. Because in life science and in biological science, we do grams percent. When somebody gets a glucose done with a glucometer, let's say it's R95 normal, that's milligrams percent. And I'll show you my blood tests, and you'll see my hemoglobin hematocrit. Hemoglobin would be in grams percent. Okay, this one, so they basically, it's just like you did in chemistry, you take sodium chloride, 0.09 grams. If you do the math vis-a-vis stoichiometry, you determine how many moles and all that stuff, then you can figure out the number of particles. Because when you put salt in water, it makes 2 particles, right? Sodium chloride. That's how. So in the old days, we used a lot of sugar water. It's called D5W. Dextrose, 5% dextrose, which is a simple monosaccharide. 5% means 5 grams of dextrose and 100 milliliters of water. It's a much bigger molecule, but it's only when it goes in water, it's only 1 particle compared to salt, so it's not. It's how many particles. And so we used a lot of that. I don't see that used as much. And then they had a chemical mixture that was closer to plasma. They used a lot in burn patients and in shock patients, which means they lost fluids, called lactated ringers. It's a mixture, it's like biologically of salts and sugars and a certain amount of acidity and things like that to try to mimic what it is. And that's used a lot, lactated ringers. Normal saline is just standard. And what makes it normal, it has to say, that's one. Why? That's what you don't want to do, and you probably have done this. We have an introductory bio. You got the little lodia leaves. We put them in normal saline. So under the microscope, and looking under the microscope, normal saline, it didn't change. Because water neither flew in, went in or went out. So what happened was, when you put it in the cell wall, basically, obviously, we'll see this particular illustration. So in plants, it's like water a plant. You put water in a plant, if you use plain water or something that's hypoosmotic or hypotonic, and that's the term we use the terms of tonicity. So the tonicity is the sort of the pull and tug, because tone means tension. So normal saline is isotonic. Plain water, let's say arbitrarily, triple distilled, hypotonic, okay, and hypertonic would be like seawater, salt water, which is usually average about 3 to 5%. That works. So if you're using plain water, hypotonic, it'll go in, it'll push the organelles against the cell wall, and the plant will be, go ahead, water me, make my day. Water plant's happy place. Hi. Right? But if you put salt water, kill it. More dead, sleep with a fish 6 feet under. Don't put salt water on your plants. You get used to it. You're already used to it. You're getting used to it. I don't know your names. I'll hold them. By the end of the time. It's only 3, 4 people. The one who's not here, whose name I know. Here's the semester. Are you going to miss us? No. Moving on. In our cells, the problem is it works both ways. Only isotonic works. If you're dehydrated, maybe there's an argument to use a hypotonic solution to rehydrate you. We used to use a little bit of half normal saline, which would be half, so it would push water into your cells. I find there's very little, we never had occasion to use hypertonic solutions. Because what that would do is it sucks the water out. And that's the whole idea. I mean, that's the whole basis for preservation. By salting or dehydrating something, you're sucking the water out of it. So if it's got bacteria, they're going to die. Bacteria hate salt. Okay? And they don't want to have the water sucked out of them. So that's why salting was the original way for preservation of foods in ancient cultures. Roman soldiers' salary, derivation of that. I did that anecdote with you, right, years ago. Did I? I didn't. They paid the Roman soldiers in salt. That's how they got their salary. They had to be worth their salt. If not, they went to these salt mines. A little history wouldn't hurt you. Also, I love those gladiator type films. Particularly with the computer graphics today, anything is possible. Heads flying all over the place. Okay, so water diffuses. Even though the water is polar, there are some molecules that can sneak. I mean, water gets in most of the time. If it doesn't get in, it's more about the tight junctions. And certainly, and there's a lot of porins. So other solvent, but for our purposes, it'll be water. They're showing it to you. This is the osmolarity, blah, 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 blah. So, and then this is the magical membrane illustration you always see. So if it's big enough for both things to move, it'll reach its own equilibrium. You'll have equal water, and you'll have equal distribution of the solutes, whatever they are. So even if you had a bunch of sodiums and a bunch of potassiums, eventually they'd equal out if they were on opposite sides. But if you only had this magical membrane with just water could pass, the only way to balance it out to get the appropriate osmolarity is for the water to move. And maybe you did, I assume they might have did this in introductory bio. Certainly in high school, they had osmometers and stuff like that. And it's pretty standard stuff. I used to do it here in the phys lab, and everybody, we used to, because let me show off my knife skills. We used to use potatoes as osmometers. And I get my Santoku knife and play Iron Chef. That's what, how do they make French fries? French fries are, by definition, raw potatoes. Home fries are cooked potatoes. So if you go with how they make good French fries, oh, we had some really good ones. Mission Barbecue makes French fries you could cry over. That good. It's a food thing. I eat, therefore I am. And so you cut the fries in McDonald's. They put them through a press. You get the fries. They soak them in water because it's hypotonic. The potatoes will pick them up. They'll firm up. They do a double fry. You do a fry around 310 Fahrenheit to cook it through, and you do a finishing fry at about 350, 360 to get it brown and crisp. That's how you make good French fries. Double fry. Sooner or later, we're going to get through to you. So this is now, all my stupid anecdotes and trying to be funny and obviously not aside, the whole idea, there are two types of pressures. Your blood pressure is hydrostatic pressure. That is pushing the fluid. And understand, it's not, you got to get over the notion that blood pressure pushes in one direction. We talked about this a little bit before. If this is a blood vessel, cylinder, like a straw, it's not, blood pressure is just not pushing it away from the heart or pushing it back to the heart. It's like this. Here's the flow, but it's flowing against the boundaries. So your blood pressure is demonstrated by the pressure against the whole vessel's whole. That's when we squeeze it with the blood pressure cuff. And that's how we're able to identify. We identify the pressure the heart needs to open it up. That's the top number. We're going to get to this when we do blood pressure. And then the bottom number, when it stops oscillating or pumping, we stop hearing the sound, okay, is called the diastolic. That's the resting tension in smooth muscles. That's the most important measure because that's how hard your heart has to work. You want that number to be low. So you want that number, you don't want that number basically over, depending on your age, never more than 90, unless you're like my age. 85 would be my doctor. Lower, the better. It's hard to go too low as long as you're not in shock. So understand that. That's hydrostatic pressure. That's pushing fluids out. So the liquid, unopposed, would seep out because there's all sorts of little openings. What holds it in are proteins. Proteins create osmotic pressure. So the proteins, these big blobs of proteins, exert a pull on water. Because what they do is they create a colloid. Milk is a colloid. Protein in milk holds the fluid in. When milk spoils, what happens? We see it, a bunch of clumpy things form, and it separates. And nowadays they already have the cartons you can't see through, but in the old days we had milk bottles and a milkman. I know. Galaxy far, far away. You had a milk thing out in front, like the key always went under the milk. Not that. This is the 50s. Disco wasn't around yet. Protein, so this is called the colloidal osmotic pressure, and these are opposing forces. So as long as you have ample proteins and appropriate blood pressure, the balance is there. What happens when you get to the capillary beds, your blood pressure drops proportionately, okay? But there's still enough of a change that when it gets into the capillary bed, there's enough pull coming from the capillary bed to pull fluids out. And when you return it, it goes in the other direction. We'll see, we're going to go over the numbers. That's why when somebody has malnutrition, which is the definition of malnutrition, is inadequate protein. They don't make enough proteins to make colloids, principally albumin. And you'll see those terrible war-torn pictures with babies and little children with big bellies. That's not fat, that's fluid, that's water that's come out of their spin the arms and legs. It's called ascites, A-S-C-I-T-E-S. That's what this is. This is what it's all about. And so the two things when there's been a natural disaster or a war-torn area or just an impoverished area, the two things that all the good guys come in and try to help with, whatever organization, the things that they need are proteins and antibiotics. They need proteins to avoid the circulatory collapse, and they need antibiotics. Inevitably, they need antibiotics because they're so predisposed to infection, because the water supply inevitably is contaminated. You have waterborne illnesses like cholera would be the most common. Cholera is really, I don't know if you learned about cholera in micro. So cholera is classic. People, there's no pristine water supply. People are going everywhere, literally going everywhere, and the cholera gets back in. It comes from the water, gets back in the water. You hear it, it's horrible. It's called rice water stools. I'm going to flatter myself. I don't know where you're going with all of you with your careers. I know where some are. This is gold. If you're going to go into a graduate level healthcare career, this is gold. Everybody, I lived it. I did this for a long time. So, hydrostatic pressure, no further movement of water. Plant cells, the cell wall fills up. Happy plant. Animal cells don't. They'll burst if there's too much water, or they'll shrink. We have different names. We used to do this in the lab with the blood lab, and maybe they'll do it for the blood lab just so you can see. It's called crenation. It's when you put. I'm super fast. If you don't know, I'm really fast with a microscope. I've been doing it. I got my first microscope when I was 6. Give me a break. I'm that kid. It was right after the chemistry set. My parents were not happy with what I did to the kitchen with the chemistry set, so they went microscopes. It's true. That kid, glasses, suspenders, pocket protector, bow tie. What? I've got the picture. The kindergarten picture follows me around. One day, if you're nice, I will show it to you. You could pick me out of a lineup. Just didn't have the glasses. Scout's honor, honest Indian. Oh, I can't say it. Honest Native American. You gotta be politically correct. I got a smile out of Jenna, which is rare. Oh, you're such a good audience. I know that. Give me a hard time. Some of you are all right. You're still ignoring me, Abby. You gotta sit closer to the front so I can see your facial expressions. All I see is the hair. I can see the hair in the glasses. But I can't. I got to get new glasses. I can't see anything these days. Moving on. Oh, my wife's concerned about it. And this is pertinent. My wife, because of a medicine she's taking, is actually having some difficulty with electrolytes. And I looked it up. It was an interesting side effect of this medicine. It's much more common in women over the age of 40. And I'm not giving away her age, but she's over 40. Oh, we've been together for 21 years. My kids, I'm making a confession. Don't judge me. She was my student. See, there you go. I heard that. Don't judge me. My kids all thought I was dating somebody like your age. I'm just saying. Yeah, I'm just saying. She's 7 years younger than I am. Give me a break. My kids were very unhappy with me for a number of years until they figured it out. Okay, so this is the thing, the tonicity, isotonic, hypertonic, hypotonic, the whole thing with sodium and molar, we're not doing it. This is the classic experiment we could do in lab when we do our blood lab. I'm very fast with the microscope. I never see this. They're doing these pictures in real time with a special setup. I focus it super fast. Every red cell is already burst. Okay, it doesn't look like this because, again, these are electron microscopic pictures. You see the typical circles of blood kind of squared off. That's the crenation. Okay, when it bursts like this, they call it plasmolysis because it lyses or bursts the plasma membrane. And normal looks like normal. Plants are different because cell wall. Not doing that. Thank goodness done with that nonsense. Bye. Moving on. I'm waiting for that. It's the highlight of my day. That concludes unactive transport. All the rest of these require energy. Active and vesicular transport. Vesicular transport is endocytosis and exocytosis. Opening and closing membrane, even though we do that probably more than almost anything else to ingest things and to expel things, requires energy. Even though the membrane is basically conserved. If we're bringing something in, we're going to spit out roughly an equal amount. So it's not like if the cell is eating it, all of a sudden it's going to shrink in on itself. Because it's going to have to excrete or exocytose something to balance it out. It's just the nature of cells, more or less. Okay, so that's, now we go to the active transport. I'm sure you had this, but this is my spin on it. So solute is too large for channels or not lipid soluble, or can't, and you're going against the gradient. And obviously you can move things in different directions. This is where sodium comes in more than any other. We are, and I'm not so much talking about sodium potassium pumps. I'm talking about a variety of sodium. We move sodium in our kidney all the time. We move sodium in other areas of our bloodstream all the time. And by moving the sodium, we're able to effectively create a flow that allows us to bring things in at the same time, co-transport or symport. And we use almost like the backflow. It's like being at the ocean. You know, and the ocean comes into the shore and bang, and it goes back out. That undertow, it takes some of the sand with it. You stand long enough, particularly on the Atlantic, get your feet buried. That's to me, that's a good kind of visual for antiport. So we're trying to max out the use of the energy. We can either use it to bring more than one molecule in, or power other systems to kick things out that are there. And so it always requires energy. Classic primary, the very famous sodium potassium pump, the single most used system vis-a-vis energy in our body. More than half of our ATP is with these pumps. We're going to spend endless amount of time on that because we're doing muscle and nerve physiology. They're constantly more than half your ATP. How much ATP does your body assemble and disassemble continuously? Because you just keep going from ATP to ADP and ADP, because I'm taking it here, I'm going to put it back in here. Roughly as much as you weigh. So if an average weight is 150 pounds, whatever you want to make that, roughly 70 kilos, you're making that much ATP if you weighed it all out, even though it's not physically tangible. Imagine that. That may be the most interesting molecule in our body because we're constantly using it. And the sodium potassium pumps are a perfect example of primary active transport. Requires energy, comes directly from ATP hydrolysis. Secondary are co-transports and anti-transports, creating additional gradients. I mean, almost indirectly, we almost do it almost indirectly in the end, I think, when we're talking about the Krebs cycle. And you start to talk about the chemiosmotic, because you're using energy to push hydrogen out to create that gradient and allowing it to come back in and spin that ATP, that imaginary ATP synthase turbine. It's to me, I try to look at things when I present physiology, so you can understand it. And I'm trying to create things where it makes sense to me. So I think that's the important thing to understand. So, causes changes in the shape of the transport protein. So the pumps, and we're going to hear about calcium and proton pumps galore, particularly hydrogen proton pumps. If you have somebody in your orbit, hopefully not you, who has to take Protonics or Prilosec or Nexium, those are proton pump blockers. Those are people who have, a lot of hyperacidity problems in the stomach. Okay? So whether they have GERD, and we'll talk about that, gastroesophageal reflux disease, or they have, and unfortunately, you're going to hear a whole bunch about GI stuff. So despite my robust, for those of you who don't know, despite my robust appearance, I've had 2 giant ulcer surgeries. I used to get ulcers, now I give them. Better to give than to receive. True. I won't mention her name. I'll tell you, this one girl who wanted to strangle. See you 10 years ago. You're giving me an ulcer. I said, thanks. It's nice to be able to give somebody something. Here's the most studied pump. Sodium potassium ATPase is what it is. We call it a pump. It's an enzyme, blah, blah, blah. All plasma membranes. As you will see shortly, every membrane is continually changing. We are constantly using. It doesn't matter because it's a dynamic system. We have what are called leak channels. Remember, we looked at those channels a little earlier last time. We have gated channels and leakage. Leakage channels are channels that are always open. We're constantly leaking out potassium and leaking in sodium. As you will see, they create what's called the resting membrane potential. It's constant. So we can balance out the sodium and potassium to create this resting potential. But then to restore the cell, you continuously have to restore it chemically. First, it adjusts electrically, then you have to have things chemically. And you're going to see, I'm going to say it a lot. We have basically electrical events precede mechanical events. Well, electrical events precede chemical events, and then chemical events precede mechanical events, which you will see. So it's not just enough to say there's a resting membrane potential, it's a dynamic system. It's going to keep doing this forever. If it's not, you're dead. So leakage channels located in membranes, all membranes, result in leaking of sodium, and we'll get to the nuances like in the heart muscle and the conducting system. There's all sorts of nuances. Leaking of sodium into the cell and leaking of potassium out. Yeah, and there's always more sodium outside the cell, and there's always more potassium inside the cell. That's because of those pumps, making sure of it. It's like what I told you with the glucose. Why is there always more glucose outside the cell? Because we change it as soon as it goes into the cell. You all should have known that. I didn't tell them. I was nice. So, sodium potassium pump works as an antiporter that pumps the sodium out of the cell and the potassium back into the cell to maintain it. It's its job. In nerve and muscle cells, they're firing so fast, those things are constantly busy. Maintains electrical chemical gradients, which involve both concentration, electrical charge, essential, da 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 da. Don't do the pictures. I mean, that's the whole 3-to-2 thing. Okay, and that's the only thing I glean out of this without going through all these pictures. Understand that passageway, if you think of it periodic table-wise, sodium is the smaller molecule on the periodic table. You know, look at the atomic numbers. So you can, in the same passageway, you can only get 2 potassiums, but you can get 3 sodiums. So you can kick out, back out to restore the gradient, 3 sodiums, and at the same time bring back in 2 potassiums to keep everything happy. That 3-to-2 relationship you're going to see again in reverse, and in the next unit that we do, which is the neuromuscular junction. We look at the motor endpoint, how muscles fire. That's why I want to get that understood thoroughly, so we could do this wet lab, and we tease rabbit muscle. Aren't you excited? The rabbit's long gone. And remember, you have to be very quiet. Working with rabbit. None of you watched cartoons when you were little? Be very quiet. We're working with rabbit. My children, my grandchildren, and surely my great-grandson will all hate me. Saturday morning, we're watching cartoons. I don't want to. Tough. Watch what I want to watch. All right, you ready? Good. Glad to hear it. Wonderful animations. It's the first of many.
The human brain alone contains about 100 billion nerve cells, called neurons. A neuron, like every other cell, has positively and negatively charged ions, inside and outside. Further, a resting neuron has a greater negative charge on the inside surface of the plasma membrane and a greater positive charge on the outside surface. This partitioning of charge creates a voltage difference across the membrane known as the resting membrane potential, which can be measured using a voltmeter. On average, an intracellular electrode records a value of minus 70 millivolts. The resting membrane potential depends on 2 factors. First, it depends on the presence of sodium and potassium gradients across the plasma membrane. Specifically, there are more sodium ions outside the neuron than inside, and more potassium ions inside the neuron than outside. Second, the resting membrane potential depends on the differential permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium ions. Leak channels in the plasma membrane allow sodium and potassium ions to diffuse or leak down their concentration gradients. The membrane contains many more potassium leak channels than sodium leak channels. Thus, the membrane is much more permeable, or leaky, to potassium ions. As positively charged potassium ions leak out of the neuron, the inside surface of the membrane becomes negatively charged compared to the outside surface. If potassium was the only ion moving, the potential would stabilize at minus 90 millivolts. However, positively charged sodium ions leak into the neuron, which slightly offsets the negative charge and raises the voltmeter reading to minus 70 millivolts. Sodium-potassium pumps actively transport sodium ions out of the neuron and potassium ions back in, compensating for the sodium and potassium leaks. Thus, the pumps help to maintain the resting membrane potential.
So, I mean, and so things that you have to glean from this, and you can obviously you can watch this many times. For the massive amount, how that's a really good animation about how the membrane is, just how many of these channels there are. So that's, and then that isn't a special cell like a nerve or a muscle cell. That's any cell. And it's not like magically, oh, I got to minus 70, I'm going to stop. It's equilibrium. It's a living system. Big notions, you have to think three-dimensionally. You have to understand this is a dynamic. We study it statically, but it's dynamic. Things are always moving around that are there. If they weren't, I mean, then the organism would not be viable. It would die. Just very simply with regard to that. So, so we're going to see that, and then we're going to build on that and get the notion of nerve and muscle cells, which have the ability to basically send a wave along. And remember, it's only on the membrane. The interior of the cell is neutral. Exterior cell, but right along the membrane, it has polarity. And all that means is you have a different accumulation of charge on the interior and the exterior. And cells that can fire, nerve and muscle cells, develop what we call an action potential, have the ability to rapidly flip-flop that. And it's just like you threw a pebble in a pond and you started ripples. Like you were going to fold the sheet, but you wanted to flap it and boom. It's like what they do when we saw the games where they're flapping the American flag. You're creating a waveform. And a lot of times the waveform is very RMU. It's unstoppable. You know, myself. Unstoppable, period. Because if it's a UPS truck, it's unstoppable without a period. Think of something more clever. So secondary active transport, okay? Gradients used indirectly. This is done at low sodium concentrations maintained by sodium potassium pump. And sodium can drag other things along, and sugars particularly. You're going to see that's a big player when you get to the kidney. Reclaiming sugars, reclaiming amino acids, lots of different kinds of mechanisms. We do the kidney at the end. It's very complicated. I'll be introducing the kidney to you. Renal physiology is complex. I learn a little bit more about it every time I teach it, and it's very complicated. You'll find that for me, and here you can see it. Here are the pumps with a 3-to-2 relationship, and then here you can see that these would represent glucose molecules that are utilizing this energy and basically creating sodium openings with the assistance of this kind of pumping mechanism to bring the glucose back into the cell, secondary active transport. And again, open and closing. So, I mean, to summarize a little bit, simple diffusion, these basically non-active transport, these non-energy dependent, these passive processes. Like simple diffusion, effectively, we assume it's nonpolar covalent, mostly respiratory gases, would be a classic example, not the only example. Facilitated diffusion is very much insulin, even though insulin is not inside the cell, but it's enabling or facilitating the change in the cell to allow glucose to enter. And now you're going to see a couple of other ones with regard to vesicular transport. It's so interesting. And it plays a pivotal role in understanding the way certain things work. So here we do, and our cells do this. I mean, your gastrointestinal tract. This is the way it works. When it brings in, whether it's liquids or solids, a lot of your white blood cells are constantly sampling the environment using that. They do that to keep. It's like anything. They're going to keep their immune system. It's use it or lose it. And I'm a firm believer of that in the body. I think I'm trying to do this. Other than I need the money. My not advanced age, but it keeps me sharp. Not this morning. I am so stupid this morning. My wife will tell. I'll be sitting there holding. I'm going. Where's my phone? I don't know where my phone is. Idiot! You're holding it in your hand. Don't tell anybody. And again, I caution you: if you get a note from anybody with a military address named Stein, he's going to be wondering if I'm walking around with my clothes on backwards, or doing more than the usual amount of inappropriate stuff. He's already sent me to the nursing home. They were supposed to come up. We were supposed to have dinner tomorrow night. That got canceled. So ATP, endocytosis, bringing it in. Basically, it all involves receptor, but classic receptor and mediated endocytosis is a little bit different. Phagocytosis, eating. Pinot, drinking, or liquids or oils. Exocytosis, reversing it. Transcytosis, and our GI tract does it a lot. They'll ingest something. Don't necessarily, if it's not being processed, it will just transit its way through the cell directly into the bloodstream. I mean, and when we look at GI, you're going to see some examples of things that have additional processing once they get into a lining cell in the gut, and once it's just basically carrying it straight through. And vesicular trafficking, obviously, that's all that cell and molecular stuff. Where it's going to go. I'm not going to do that. Because our body has magical ways of doing that. So formation of protein-coated vesicles, they all involve proteins. So what typically happens, receptors are triggered by the presence of certain chemical agents, whether they're nutrients, whether they're medications or something out. Very, very selective in nature. So it's a unique receptor, as all receptors are, pretty much. Okay, so, and this is a problem. This is a real difficult. We'll get some examples of pathogens hijacking this mechanism. Okay, for instance, COVID was a little bit different. COVID attached to a particular rep, and it altered the receptor. It made the receptor do the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to be anti-inflammatory and became pro-inflammatory. And we'll learn about there was an angiotensin converting enzyme type 2 receptor. And we'll look at that a little bit in respiratory and things like that. And then once it gets inside, inevitably, and you all know this already, anything that comes in that's contained in a vesicle is going to have to interact, unless it's just transiting through. It's going to have to be, it joins and it forms that phagosome. So you have the endosome comes in, and it bonds with a lysosome, and the lysosome again is nothing more than a vesicle permanent, inside your cell that contains enzymes for digestion and defense. Basically they interact. If it's digestion, they digest it. If it's a bad guy, they destroy it. You spit out the contents, you exocytose out, and that's basically what our cells do. So it's a safeguard. That's the whole idea of membrane-bound organelles. The fact that it's encased in membrane, it's like it's protectively wrapped, so it doesn't act us more than it necessarily would. And they just go through all these, and I'm sure you've seen this. So the proteins effectively are the receptors. They're shed, and then it's either going to just transit its way through completely and go out, or it's going to undergo some process with the lysosome. There, just summarizing that relatively quickly. I don't want to go crazy. It's not a process I'm that terribly interested in. So the endocytosis is referred to as cell eating, and obviously drinking or sampling would be the pinocytosis. And again, the beauty of it's all about, as the particles come close, they begin to induce change. The receptor proteins, they induce change. And what happens? We begin to see that. You know, those particles aren't just, once they're beginning to adhere, they're signaling effectively as they come in close proximity. They begin to signal and they alter the underlying microfilaments, the little actin filaments, and they begin to change the shape of the cell. They form the typical amoeboid type things, those pseudopods, you know. See, that's what I love about this. It's a food thing. There's food. Let's grab it. Gotcha. Suck it right in. I'm having an old food fragment for dinner. Dr. Lecter, remember him? Silence of the Lambs. Oh God, I'm so. That is only 1991. No Silence of the Lamb fans? Dr. Lecter? Hannibal the Cannibal? You didn't like it? It's scary. Filmed here in Pittsburgh. Yeah. The Silence of the Lambs. The house you could have bought recently. I'm surprised you didn't. That whole little, you know, Buffalo Bill's house. Yes, Clarice. All that type of stuff. And so that's the amoeboid motion. Here's what's happening. The receptors not only attach to whatever the particle is, but they induce the pseudopods. Penocytosis is very similar with this. Environmental sampling, you're going to see a lot of nutrients in the small intestine because they're really mostly in liquid phase. Okay. And again, membrane is conserved. And lastly, and I don't want to give it short shift, so I'll come back and do this. This idea of receptor mediated, why this is so important is this. Okay. And if we're here on Monday, I'll start with it. If not, I'll remember to start with it otherwise on Monday. So thank you. Be careful. Just come tomorrow afternoon, late afternoon, it's going to get bad. The last one of these that was this bad was 2010. Where we had projecting over, we had more than 10, 12 inches.